The 1950s was the heyday of world boxing. Such fighters as Sugar Ray Robinson, Rocky Marciano, Sonny Liston, and Jake LaMotta entered the ring at that time. It was rightfully called the golden age of boxing. However, at the same time when the audience was admiring the fights of the famous champions, behind the scenes there were events that could destroy boxing because the Mafia got so deep into it that they actually took over the sport. They were not interested in the sporting aspect, they were only interested in the money. No matter how good a boxer was, you could not become a champion if he did not play by the rules of the gangsters, and vice versa. Even a terrible fighter could easily be made into a champion with the help of the right people, who would then reap the benefits of his supposed success. Fake fights became the norm even at the highest level. Fighters' managers had to pay kickbacks in order to hold fights, and many champions were directly owned by mafiosi. Today, I will tell you the story of how organized crime was able to take over one of the most popular sports in America, actually making it their plaything. Meet the Mafia and boxing on the other side of the law. I want to ask you to take your mind off the video for a moment and look at the cool print I made for you. If you like it, you could buy any product you like by clicking the link in the description. And of course, every item you purchase contributes to the growth and advancement of the channel. Thank you for your attention. Now let's dive deeper into the story of our hero for today. We'll start our story today a bit from afar to trace the entire path of the Mafia's infiltration into boxing. After all, as you might have guessed, it did not happen overnight. It was not the case that before the 1950s, boxing was clean, and then out of nowhere came the mafiosi, who blackened everything. In general, the connection between American boxing and organized crime is mutual. By that I mean that many fighters at the end of their boxing careers retrained as gangsters, and many gangsters entered boxing as managers or promoters. And this is by no means surprising. After all, both aspects center on violence. However, today we will not go into the psychological and social reason why gangsters were drawn to martial arts and fighters went into crime. Today we are concerned with the other side of the issue. Had boxing failed to make money, then most likely the interest of gangsters in this sport would have been limited to a couple of enthusiasts. And since the real situation was 180 degrees opposite, it is worth digging in this direction. First of all, how did it start? Boxing is very easy to fix. It is not soccer or baseball where dozens of people are involved. 2 guys in the ring and a few referees. It's enough to bribe one of them and the result will be fixed. For example, if you pay money to one boxer to throw the match, the other doesn't even need to know about it. Or you could pay a referee in the ring to help your fighter. He could stop the fight when your guy is cornered or delay the count if he is knocked down, among other little tricks. Naturally, such an opportunity attracted gangsters who organized fake fights. So crime got into boxing and grew along with it, and in proportion to the growth of the revenues of the sport. The first to lift betting on boxing to a really significant level was Sonny Madden. Let's begin our story with him. By the way, the story of Madden is interesting not only in the context of the penetration of organized crime into boxing, but also separately as an independent crime figure of note on his own. After all, Madden was one of a very small number of gangsters who got started back at the turn of the 20th century in those famous fights shown by Martin Scorsese in Gangs of New York. Then they managed to adjust the new realities of organized crime, which moved from petty extortion to infiltration of labor unions and trade in illegal alcohol. More often than not, such gangsters either simply faded into the background, such as the leaders of the 2 largest gangs of the late 19th century in the persons of Monk Eastman and Paul Kelly, or ended up in the grave. Madden was a rare exception. As I said earlier, Madden started his criminal path back in the environment of street gangs, making money on theft and petty extortion. Madden quickly rose in the hierarchy of his gang, becoming its leader and earning the nickname Killer, and you could see why. Then in the early 1910s, Madden received a 20-year prison sentence, serving just under 9 years, getting out early for good behavior. It was already 1923, Prohibition was in full swing, union racketeers were gaining strength, and Madden's former gang had faded into oblivion. Nevertheless, he managed to reorganize and join the game under the new rules, again becoming one of the key gangsters of New York. What exactly he did is a topic for a separate video biography. Let's move on to how Madden got into boxing. Madden loved this sport and regularly went to fights. And when he began to have money from bootlegging and racketeering, Madden began to sponsor young boxers. Naturally, his investments had to be repaid, so fighters often participated in rigged fights. And it wasn't always Madden's boxers who had to go down for the count, sometimes to promote his guy. Madden either bribed or intimidated the opponent to throw the fight. In this way, you could create an image of an undefeated, talented fighter, and then once everyone has bought into that image, you can bet on his defeat and get good odds and big payouts. Madden ran such scams for several years, and then an idea came to him. Why not make a mediocre fighter into a world champion and then raise good money on his sensational defeat? And Madden had everything for such a scheme except the fighter himself. It was necessary to find a guy who was not too smart, because he would not be in on the scam, but at the same time physically strong, so that at first glance everyone believed that he could become a champion. Madden found a strong man from a touring circus named Primo Carnera. The guy was 6.5 feet tall, not lacking in musculature, and his fists resembled sledgehammers rather than human hands. He was trained by former lightweight world champion Abe Attell, who was just as immersed in crime as Madden, so he wouldn't have blabbed about his real plans for Carnera as a boxer. Attell, by the way, worked for a long time as a bodyguard for Arnold Rothstein, about whom I have a separate video on my channel. Madden gave Carnera a promotional tour of the country before his first professional fight, and then, using the methods listed above, arranged for Primo to win the world championship. All of the Giants' opponents were either bought or intimidated, and Madden raised good money on these fake fights. The insurmountable obstacle that finally forced Madden to drop Carnera was boxer Max Baer. Primo Carnera was scheduled to have a title defense match against Baer in 1934. As always, Madden sent his men to buy the opponent, but Max Baer flatly refused. Then came the threats, but even then, Baer stood his ground. It seemed he would rather die than throw a world title fight. Madden did not dare to go to extreme measures, eventually leaving Baer alone, and bet money on the defeat of Carnera. Baer eventually won. Carnera ended up in a hospital bed with a broken jaw, nose, and several ribs. And Madden, having made good money, disappeared from Primo's life without even paying for his treatment. Madden was the first to pull off such a scam at such a high level of the sport, but in the end, he left boxing without much impact on the industry as a whole. However, no place is empty, and very soon instead of Madden, a man named Frank Carbo appeared. And compared to his cases, Madden's scam was just child's play. When Madden was running his Carnera scam, Boxing Olympus was being ascended by promoter Mike Jacobs, who would rule the industry for decades to come. But we're not going to tell you his story today, as he has a minimal connection to crime. All you need to know is that he took boxing to a new level, raised the public's interest in it, thus increasing the amount of money that was circulating in the industry. We are now more interested in the story of another man who would succeed him in the future. Paul John Carbo, who in the future would be called Frankie Carbo, was born in New York in 1904. He spent his childhood in the Lower East Side and from an early age was immersed in crime, because of which he was sent to a correctional boarding school for troubled teens when he was 11 years old. The boarding school, of course, did not correct him, and the older Frankie Carbo became, the more he was sucked into the mire of illegal affairs. As a result, he went to jail again, this time in a real prison for the manslaughter of a cab driver. Carbo then received 2 years and was released after 20 months for good behavior. Later, Carbo would get into a notorious gang called Murder Incorporated. Among the famous hits he performed while being a member of this gang were the murders of gangsters Mickey Duffy, Max Haskell, and Max Greenberg. For the latter, he was, incidentally, tried along with Bugsy Siegel. Perhaps it had been Carbo who had ordered the hit. Carbo avoided punishment in the Murder Incorporated murders, and after that, Carbo worked his way up to become the main man in the boxing industry. Carbo started small. He signed a few boxers and started making money from a percentage of their fees. And in order to get more, he extracted payments for his fighters from the organizers of fights. The second way Carbo got his money was, of course, with fake fights, which were organized according to the same principles developed by Madden. As Carbo's roster of boxers gradually grew, more and more money came in, and in order to continue growing in the industry, he had to somehow deal with Mike Jacobs, who had a firm grasp on supremacy via his ownership of one of the most talented heavyweight champions in the world, Joe Louis. In the mid-1940s, Jacobs was nearly assassinated. He survived, but the old man's health took a turn for the worst. Whether Carbo was involved is not known, but after that, Jacobs sold him his 20th Century Boxing Club in Madison Square Garden for $100,000. And now the International Boxing Club, or IBC for short, controlled by Carbo, was given the right to organize fights at the premier American boxing arena, Madison Square Garden. So almost without resistance, Frankie Carbo got to the top of the industry. From now, he would now rake in everything he could reach. To give you an idea of the scale of Carbo's achievement, the IBC held 47 of 51 championship fights in the US from 1949 to 1955 under their auspices, profiting from each of them not only from ticket sales, but also from the sale of television rights. We're not talking about the fights that didn't have a title on the line, and there were many more of those, undercard fights, which sucked in an influx of betting cash. In addition to Carbo in this racket, it is worth noting several other important people. His criminal associate Frank Palermo, nicknamed Blinky, as well as two people who were the faces of the IBC, a wealthy businessman, James Norris, as well as a famous lawyer, Truman Gibson. Together, these guys organized a network that made huge amounts of money off the fights. First of all, Carbo still owned the fighters and got money from their fees. I'll tell you later about the role Carbo played in the life of heavyweight champion Sonny Liston. Secondly, it became easier for Carbo to organize fake fights and make money from betting. What follows is an example of how it worked. Thirdly, Carbo had practically total control over fights at the main boxing venue in the country, where many boxers wanted to fight. And you guessed it, yes, he often took money just to let someone fight at Madison Square Garden. Fourthly, he made a lot of money on the legal side of the business. The tickets and the TV broadcasts made a lot of money. And fifth, every other advantage you could think of that applies to an industry monopoly. But in order not to be undersubstantiated, instead of abstract enumeration of this power this man held in the world of boxing, listen to concrete examples of his influence on the concrete fates of boxers. Let's start with Jake LaMotta. If you've seen the movie Raging Bull by Martin Scorsese starring Robert De Niro, then you know this story. Jake LaMotta was born in the Lower East Side of New York City in 1922 to an extremely poor family. His father drank mercilessly and beat little Jake just as mercilessly. Since LaMotta could not cope with his father, he vented his anger on his peers, constantly getting into fights. The fights were followed by stealing and robbery, which eventually led Jake to a correctional boarding school. There he met boxing, which became his way to vent his anger. Once free, LaMotta continued his training, making significant progress in the field. Here he was noted by the guys from the Mafia, who constantly hung around in boxing gyms to lure talented fighters under their wing, squeeze the maximum out of them, and eventually dump them into the trash. Jake knew firsthand what these guys were like. He'd been friends with many of them and gone to bars and clubs together with them, but he didn't want to trust them with his career. He had been threatened, of course, but it had never gotten physical. Perhaps the fact that he was in their circle saved him from such drastic measures. In the ring, however, LaMotta was making considerable progress. In New York, of course, Carbo did not let him perform as Jake refused to play on their terms, but outside of Madison Square Garden, LaMotta was involved in excellent fights, with many more wins than losses. In 6 years of appearances, he fought 78 fights, winning 64 of them, losing 11, and drawing 3 times, while never getting knocked out. He was called the uncrowned middleweight champion of the world, but he still hadn't gotten a championship fight. The fault, of course, was the Mafia. In addition to blocking a championship fight for LaMotta, the gangsters also occasionally bribed the judges to make sure Jake lost. They didn't touch him physically, but they beat him psychologically, mercilessly, so LaMotta, who wanted to become a world champion, finally broke down and made a deal with the mobsters. He had to lose, and in return he would get a long-awaited title fight and $100,000 in cash. The fight was against Billy Fox, who was rumored to be promoted by Carbo and Palermo, just like Primo Carnera had been promoted by Madden back in the day. Jake played by the gangster rules, getting his title fight and winning it. And Carbo, Palermo, and others involved made some good money betting on Fox, who was considered an underdog. Whether LaMotta would have gotten his title if he hadn't gotten involved in this venture, we don't know. Perhaps the mobsters would have never let him near the title. Carmen Basilia was born in 1927 in upstate New York in the town of Casnastoda. Although his family was not rich, unlike LaMotta, his parents did not beat him, but loved and supported him. So when he told them that he wanted to become a boxer instead of working in the onion fields for a living, his parents only wished him luck. Basilio started his boxing lessons in high school at a local gym, then continued during his military service, and after graduating he signed a contract with 2 managers, Don DeJohn and Joe Nitro. It was they who helped organize his first professional bout in November 1948, and by the end of the same year, Carmen managed to engage in 4 fights and win all of them. Basilio's career went steadily upwards, and by 1953, he was one of the brightest and most promising fighters in the welterweight division. Like LaMotta, however, he did not get his title fight. Why became clear when Carbo invited his manager, Basilio DeJohn, to a meeting. Frankie Carbo explained to him that if they wanted a title fight, they had to share a portion of their fee with Carbo and his underlings. DeJohn told this to Basilio, but the man, as the story goes, refused to give up part of his fee and said that if DeJohn wanted to fight on those terms, then let him appease Carbo's appetite out with his own pocket. DeJohn did the math and came to the conclusion that he was still getting a good deal at that rate and agreed to the deal. Basilia then fought Kid Gavilan. The fight turned out to be extremely controversial, but Gavilan won by split decision. And most likely everything was set up from the beginning, as Gavilan belonged to Carbo's partner, Blinky Palermo. Basilia had one option to win, a knockout, but he did not achieve it. The next title fight that Carmen got was in 1955. The opponent was Tony DeMarco, and Basilia's managers once again paid Carbo for the opportunity, this time through a guy named Gabe Genovese. Carmen won the fight, as well as a rematch that same year, thus becoming the welterweight champion of the world. It would later be revealed that the price for making this possible was that Basilia's managers had continuously paid kickbacks to Carbo for every fight since the DeMarco fight. A total of $67,000 in such payments had been confirmed. And in doing so, Carbo was not at all shy about unilaterally tweaking Basilia's fights. As, for example, in the fight with Johnny Saxton, who had a longer arm span, just ran the whole fight, eventually getting a split decision victory, which critics called undeserved, hinting at the venality of the judicial panel. Soon they had a rematch where Saxton did not run, but used chopping. Naturally, he lost to Basilio, who was extremely good in this area. Their third fight was also won by Carmen Basilia, and Carbo made a lot of money out of it. First, he bet on the underdog Saxton, and then in the second fight on Basilio's slim chances. There's a reason Saxton fought the second fight in a manner that didn't favor him. In contrast, by the way, belonged to the same Blinky Palermo. There were also rumors that Basilio's second fight with Sugar Ray Robinson was also fixed by Carbo, but there was less evidence there. Sonny Liston, for the general audience, went down in history as the one who lost to Muhammad Ali. However, boxing fans know that Liston himself was an extremely fearsome opponent in his time. It was not for nothing that Tyson was compared to Liston in the early days. They were both excellent punchers who were feared by opponents in the ring. Sonny was born into a dysfunctional family with many children in the early 1930s in Arkansas. His father was often violent to both the children and his wife, causing Liston's mother to take the youngest children with her and flee to St. Louis. Sonny, who was 13 years old at the time, knew where his mother was going and after saving up money for a ticket, followed her. Sonny Liston thought that St. Louis was a small village where everyone knew each other, so it would be easy to find his mother. Of course, he was wrong. St. Louis was not a small town even then, so Sonny had to walk around the city for several days and ask passerbys if they knew his mother. He ended up getting help from the police, who found Liston sleeping by the garbage cans, so Sonny went to live with his mother. Liston was an extremely large child, exceeding his peers in size by 1.5 to 2 times. Add to this anger instilled by him by his oppressive father, and we get a teenage rebellion, which could not result in anything other than criminal activity. Sonny became the leader of a small teenage gang engaged in robbery. Naturally, this lifestyle led him to prison. Here, his physical talent was noticed by a local priest, Father Stevens, who persuaded him to take up boxing. Thanks to natural gifts, Liston made amazing progress. He almost immediately managed to become the best in the local gym, which was not surprising. He had one of the longest arms in the history of world boxing, as well as the largest fist, if you do not count Nikolai Valuev, and all this at a height of 6 feet. Liston was a real unicorn, and Father Stevens managed to prove it to authorities, getting Sonny out on parole. Right after his release, Liston performed in amateur boxing, but very quickly reached the ceiling there. There were simply no suitable opponents for him. Then Sonny signed a contract with local businessman Frank Mitchell, who became his representative. However, almost immediately, the rights to the boxer went to a mobster from St. Louis named John Vitale. By the way, at first, when Liston wasn't making enough money to live off of boxing, he moonlighted as a fighter for Vitale, breaking strikes of disgruntled construction workers. When Liston's career took off, Carbo and Palermo stepped in to share the rights to him. Officially, Sonny was represented by a man named Joe Baroni. The gangsters were leading Liston to the world title, and they didn't even have to tamper with it. Sonny did it himself, and the mobsters just skimmed the cream off the top in the form of profits. The only obstacle to the championship was Custa Amato, the trainer and manager of then world champion Floyd Patterson. He was one of the few who somehow resisted Carbo's dominance, and he did not want the world title to go to the gangster. D'Amato would not agree to the Patterson-Liston fight until the early 1960s, when Carbo and Palermo would already be behind bars. However, Liston still had a mob trail behind him, and the World Championship belt fell into the hands of gangsters when Sonny beat Patterson. And then young and bold Cassius Clay appeared on the scene, who then changed his name to Muhammad Ali. He challenged Liston to a fight, and when Liston signed on, Ali gave him a thrashing in the best traditions of modern mixed martial arts. However, no one considered Ali to be anything but a talker at the time. Liston was an unqualified favorite. The way he had dealt with Patterson before, as if he were fighting against an amateur boxer, made critics call him the greatest heavyweight of all time. In the ring, however, it turned out that Ali was tactically outplaying Liston in the dry. He didn't go into an open exchange with him, but tried to wear down the older Liston by constantly moving around the ring. There's no telling how the fight would have ended up. It's quite possible that Sonny would still have gotten in and knocked out the young brazen man, but he was unable to go to the 7th round due to a shoulder injury. Technically, the title went to Ali, but no one took it seriously. Nothing was decided in the fight, which meant a rematch was necessary. And that's where the dark side of the story begins. In the first round of the rematch, Liston fell from a punch that barely touched him, then theoretically got down on one knee and fell again, like a soccer player faking a rules violation. In total, Sonny lay on the canvas for 17 seconds, which according to the boxing rules is 11 more than allowed and symbolized a knockout. No one, including Ali himself, was happy with this outcome of the fight. The spectators wanted a continuation, calling it all a circus and a rigged match, but it does seem as though everything had been decided long before the fight. Most likely the mobsters saw that Liston's days were numbered and that he could easily lose to Ali, so they decided to make the money, while Liston's defeat was still giving good odds. This was confirmed in particular by the words of Johnny Tocco, owner of a boxing gym in Las Vegas, who shortly before the fight was told about Ali's first-round victory by John Vitale, who still owned part of Liston's contract. The second confirmation was a cell phone recording of Liston's wife that turned up in the FBI's possession. She can be clearly heard stating that since her husband's defeat was inevitable, he decided to fall in the first round so as to suffer less damage to his health. Ali probably knew nothing about the bout, as he himself was furious and shouted for Liston to get up, which eventually became the most famous photo in the history of world boxing. After the fight with Ali, Liston had 16 more fights, but it was already the sunset of a fighter who could well have been the greatest of all time. Sonny became addicted to alcohol and heroin, gradually losing the last of his boxing talents, and eventually passing away in 1971 from a heroin overdose. It was said that his death was also blamed on the Mafia, from whom he extorted money for his silence about a rematch with Ali. It can be seen from the previous told examples, the union of Carbo and Palermo, with their IBC, tightly controlled the entire boxing industry. There were no individual fighters and managers who were not affiliated with them in one way or another. Even the most illustrious champions were smeared, even the most famous title fights were rigged. Carbo had so many boxers and managers in his pocket, so many judges ready to make a buck, that he shuffled champions, challengers, and no-names as he pleased. He played the multi-million-dollar industry that the lion's share of Americans were interested in back then like his army of soldiers. But, as is so often the case in such situations, he outplayed his hand. Carbo always remained in the shadows, whether it was organized fights or managing boxers. They even nicknamed him Mr. Gray for it. But in fact, he was in charge. It was for this that the authorities nailed him first, putting him in jail for 2 years on charges of operating without a license. Carbo thought he had gotten off easy, but another case came up. Boxer Don Jordan, along with his manager, Don Nissette, reported threats from Carbo and his associates. The gangsters wanted Jordan to play by their rules, but the fighter categorically refused, so they began to intimidate him in every possible way. But he, instead of being scared into submission, eventually went to the police. The authorities built a racketeering case on their testimony and put Carbo in prison for 25 years. His closest partner, Blinky Palermo, received 15 years in prison. The presence of gangsters in boxing, of course, was not limited to Carbo and Palermo. The same Anthony Salerno was involved in Patterson's championship fight against Johansson, and dozens of other gangsters made money off fighters much lower in the rankings than we've ever heard of, and never will. However, Carbo was the one who got the tightest grip on the industry and actually ran it for a decade. After he was locked up, the presence of gangsters in boxing didn't disappear, but no one else had that kind of power.